அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். நான் நியூயார்க் தமிழ் சங்கத்திலிருந்து ரங்கா பேசுகிறேன். இன்னைக்கு வந்து அட்டர்னி ஜான் ஆல்பர்ட் அவர்களை அறிமுகப்படுத்த வந்திருக்கிறேன். ஜான் ஆல்பர்ட் is a veteran lobbyist and is counsel for the government relations and public affairs firm Bolton St. John's, where he represents non-profits, cultural organizations, and corporations. Among his accomplishments are successfully advocating for legislation related to anti-stalking and anti-hate crimes, and notably securing approvals for the major improvements at the US Tennis Association Billie Jean King National Tennis Center at Queens, New York. John is active in numerous local organizations and has also been recently elected as Democratic District Male Leader for the 24th Assembly District. John has been named to the 2020 Queens Power 50 and 2020 Power of Diversity by New York City. These lists recognize the most influential unelecteds in the borough, the appointees, advocates, community leaders, and others who are moving the borough forward. And John has also been named in Asian 100 by State of New York, the most influential Asian Americans in New York politics and policy. John holds a Juris Doctor and is admitted to practice before New York and Connecticut Bar. அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். நான் நியூயார்க் தமிழ் சங்கத்திலிருந்து ரங்கா பேசுகிறேன். இன்னைக்கு வந்து அட்டர்னி ஜான் ஆல்பர்ட் அவர்களை அறிமுகப்படுத்த வந்திருக்கிறேன்.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. First, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation and for Ranga for the very nice introduction. This presentation is going to be in English, and part of the intro that Ranga didn't mention is I left a very small village near Thoothukudi when I was 7 years old. And so I have a second grade ability to speak in Tamil, and some of these concepts are going to be very complicated. And so the one thing I do know in Tamil is when my parents were yell at me. And so if you have complaints about my presentation afterwards, I'll definitely hear those complaints and I'll understand them perfectly in Tamil. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and we can go through some of these slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So that's me, and that's my contact information, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. So we're going to jump right into this. So this presentation, just so folks are familiar with what I hope that you can achieve through the presentation, it's most useful for US-based nonprofits and folks who are thinking of providing social services in the US. For those who are not in this field particularly, I think you can still gain a lot from this presentation, because I gained a lot from hearing the presentations that preceded me, right? So the fundraising, the ability to solve problems, identify problems, all of these are applied in the nonprofit sector as well. And so we know that the skills that you've learned in the previous session can be applied here as well. So those folks who are going to get the most useful things out of this presentation are those who are seeking a better understanding of government's role in providing services, as well as if you just want to learn the vocabulary of this field, there are very specific terms to familiarize yourself with. At the end of the presentation, I'm hoping that you will review your organizational papers and your compliance and get yourself ready to receive these awards, but more importantly, include getting government grants from your strategic planning and part of your service delivery. So why do governments give grants to begin with, right, to nonprofits? The most easy answer is that they've been required by law to provide social services. So a piece of legislation has passed, and they have to find a solution. In many ways, this really ties in with the previous presentation, right? It's they have identified a problem that they cannot solve themselves, and they're looking for people to solve those problems. And so they've done that first step that we heard of in the previous presentation in identifying a problem. Now they have looking for a person to solve those problems. And that's why government looks to give grants to nonprofits. Another reason that they get involved is cost. It's very expensive for government to provide these services themselves. And so they are looking for people to provide these services at lower cost than what a government employee would do. And so, as you know, a full-time equivalent for a government employee is not just their salary, but includes their benefits and very generous pensions. And so their government is always looking to reduce those costs by contracting or granting out to nonprofits. The other reason, a little less cynical, I hope, is that they understand that nonprofits have very specific localized knowledge and expertise. So your nonprofit or the solution that you're providing through your temple or your church or your local cultural institution, you have access to the populations that they want access to. So those are among the reasons that government give these grants. And so, so how does government solicit interests from nonprofits, right? So how are they reaching out to us to see what we can do? And so this is some of the vocabulary building that I mentioned a little bit earlier. First, it's highly likely they might put out what's called an RFI. And this is an important term to learn, because what they're basically asking is they're laying out their problem and asking you to solve it. It may not lead to a contract explicitly, but if they like what you say, then they may bring you back in for further discussions to find out what your solution is. And so this RFI is something that's quite common. They've, depending on the field, whatever it is, they've identified a problem, but they don't have a solution. So that's one form of getting a grant, is to responding to an RFI and then getting a contract subsequent to that. Less frequent is something called a request for quotation. And we won't do too much on it here, but they've already found a problem. They may have come up with a solution, and they're going to ask you how much it costs to provide that service. That I see less and less of, but what happens mostly is what is the final thing on this slide, which is a request for proposal. The proposals are released, and what they're asking for is they've identified a problem. They have a rough idea of what the solution is, and then they're seeking proposals from multiple vendors to solve the problem. And so we're going to do a deep dive into these proposals a little later in the presentation. So here's some good ideas on and some necessary ideas before you start seeking a grant award. And so I'm hoping that this presentation builds your toolbox and gets you ready to actually apply for a grant and be successful in getting a grant. The first thing is, if you are US based, and I know there are many folks on this at the conference who are not US based, but it gives you a sense of how most governments have laid this out, right? So just using the US as an example, first in the US, you have to obtain your federal nonprofit status, and that requires filling out a substantial amount of paperwork. Many people hire lawyers to do this. Others hire specific CPAs who have the expertise in filling this out. So that's certified public accountants. And it's very important to make sure that you obtain the designation for the charitable purpose that you wish to provide your service. And here's what I mean. And I'm just using, let's say, the Tamil Sangam in New York, for example. It's their 50-year anniversary. When they had originally conceived of starting the organization was to promote the culture, the Tamil culture in New York, through shows promoting literature, and their articles of incorporation with the state may have had a very limited purpose from which they are starting their organization. Many years later, they may have decided, and I think pretty soon after they decided, to do charitable work. Now the question is, is their paperwork compatible with the charitable purpose that now in which they're doing the charity work? So if they went to seek a grant from the government can ask, let's see your paperwork, and say, well, you're not really a social service organization, you're a cultural organization, you don't qualify. And so one of the things that I advise my clients to do is when you're forming your organization, have a broad perspective. And this happens as well in houses of worship. So you may start a temple and want to do charity work, and there may be opportunities to get grants, but none of the paperwork matches what you're actually doing. And so it's very important to do this. And I mentioned in my first slide, what I hope that you do at the end of this is just to go over your paperwork to make sure it's in compliance. In the US, you have an opportunity to be both certified at the state level, right? You're as a nonprofit, and at the federal level. And it's good to do both. And many people don't realize this, but there are state nonprofit status requirements as well. And this is where you would file your paperwork with your state to have articles of incorporation. Again, making sure that you have the capacity in the paperwork that you submit to do things like raise money and to do charitable work. I think a lot of people just assume since you're doing good that you can do whatever you'd like. But some of these fields are very heavily regulated, and I highly recommend that you take a look at what your local laws are as well. For example, in New York, there are requirements when you raise money, and I don't mean donations to a cause that you're just passing along, but if you're raising money in your own name, there are certain registrations that you need to make. And I would suggest that all of your organizations, whatever you're involved in the nonprofit world, that you make sure that you're in compliance with those. I know it seems like a lot of paperwork before actually providing services to people, but there's one thing to do good, right? That your heart is in the right place to serve people, but then there's another thing to do it well. And to do it well requires you to do all the work that leads up to it. The other thing before seeking a grant I would suggest is make sure that the paperwork is in order. Many organizations are longstanding, and as you're filing particularly your taxes, to make sure that all of them have been filed and are correct. So I just list two. One is the Form 990. All nonprofits in the US are required to file that. In New York, there's an additional form called the CHAR 500. And I'm sure in your state, there'll be some similar requirements. The other tip is to pre-register. Many of the avenues in which you can apply for grants allow you to submit all of these documents in advance. So when you see an opportunity, you're not searching for the documents or fumbling around. So you can pre-register. So I'm going to shift now to just where the grant opportunities are. And I don't want this just to be a list of where all the websites. So I think you can probably find them on your own. But here are some of them. One is, this is for federal grant opportunities. I think the really important thing to know is there is a system for this. It's grants.gov. Some of the requirements, again, they have their own, every single layer of government has their own requirements and requires you to register and to submit paperwork. And so they have a system called Systems Awards Management. So even before you apply and before you get awarded, they expect you to be in the system. And so it's worth spending some time on this website. It's searchable in many ways. You can type in the areas that you want to serve and the populations that you want to serve or geographies that you want to serve, and they will be able to help find grants that are available. The other thing is to know the jurisdiction, right? And so the federal scope of what the federal government does in the US is actually very limited in terms of social services. And so many of these programs are, I would say, most of the funding is going to come to you from the state or from the local level. The federal dollars do exist, but the problem with federal grants are they're also states themselves are eligible to compete against you for those same very dollars. So if you would have to compete, you'd have to prove that somehow you are better than the state of Texas in doing this particular service. And so it's just the heightened competition for federal grants, I think you should be aware of. At the state and local level, again, as I mentioned, there are multiple opportunities. I think there are actually more opportunities at the state and local level. Here are just some of them. I just gave New York as an example because most of my practice is in New York. One of these things that I really want to emphasize is that doing the work ahead of time, not only this paperwork that I mentioned, but actually doing the substantive work of serving people gives you an advantage when you go to apply. And so, you know, I think.
Reminder for the time. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, please conclude in next few minutes.
Sure, absolutely. So here are a couple of things, and there are other ways to jump into this. One is the easiest way to get money is actually writing your local elected official a letter. That seems very simple enough, but you have to have the context in order to do that. And so I just want to make sure that if you're going through that method, and I think many people have that impression that that is the primary way to receive grants, is writing your local elected official. That avenue exists. It's just it's not a sustainable way of funding your services and programs. The other, there are available funding for capital funding. I was able to get an Indian an Indian nonprofit in New York, close to $3 million for a building that they were going to build. So there are different types of awards as well. It's not just for service delivery. So you should really look into that. Again, depending on your jurisdiction. So here are some real, and this is real takeaways. One is you got to develop a history of providing the services that you're applying for. It'll help you with the obtaining letters of recommendation. One, you know, I mentioned this before, make sure your legal and compliance paperwork is complete, and make sure your materials reflect that it's open to everyone. So again, I worked with an Indian a US-based Indian organization, very proud that all of their leaders and everything that they were doing were very Indian American focused. And that became problematic when they wanted to open up a service that served everyone. And so government was really skeptical that these programs would be open to everyone, and we had a lot of work to do. So just be mindful of that. The other thing to do is to evaluate your programs. Once you do some work, make sure you capture how many people you're serving and what their outcomes are, because the government will eventually want to know. Some other best practices, I would say that one is, if you are eligible, and depending on what your state or city allows, you might want to seek small business enterprise designations. In some places, nonprofits are eligible for those. You might want to consider hiring a professional grant writer. All of these things are scored by folks who expect you to respond in perfect English. And I've seen proposals thrown out and not given full scores because of typos and things like that. So, you know, just professionalism is really important. Again, follow page limits, follow font size requirements. These all sound like small things, but you have to really make sure everything is to the highest levels, right?
Thank you, John.
So I'm going to conclude there, right? So again, once the awards are awarded, and I hope you get these awards, just be mindful of when you're getting paid. One thing, and just the most important thing on the slide, is that government usually pays after the service is provided. So people think I'm going to get a check the minute I win my award and I'm going to start my services. But in many instances, they expect you to provide the services far in advance. So just be mindful of that. And so I was following some of the questions. And so this was a question that came up in advance of and I wanted to address it. You know, many people said, I want to get a grant from the US government to do work in Tamil Nadu. And so I have had to work on this. And so I will say this is, I have applied for State Department grants through the US government to do work in Chennai and other places. And so those do exist. And so I want to conclude with that. My concluding thought is this, is just that all of the presentations that you've heard up to this point, they actually build to the work that nonprofits do as well. So funding, coming up with unique, identifying a unique problem and getting a unique solution, all of those things apply to nonprofits as well. So I want to thank you for thinking of the community and wanting to do nonprofit work, and I'm happy to help wherever I can. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, Mr. John. John has given an amazing presentation, especially about non-profit. எழுமின் கூட ஒரு non-profit organization. இது போன்ற அமைப்புகள் ஒரு பெரும் கனவுகளுடன் வரும்போது என்னென்ன மாதிரியான நிதி எடுக்க வேண்டும், எப்படி அதை வந்து அது he asked, like, if we can get the grant for medical research to find the cure for the specific illness and disease, is the first question. And then the other question from Thamari Chelvan from Singapore, one of our good friends, and he's asking, is the grant available even in Singapore and other countries? I think you partly answered, but yeah, if you can.
Right. So for the first question, yes, there are numerous grants available for medical research. It's just again, what ends up happening is you have to register yourself with those websites that I mentioned, and they will ask for your profile and the areas in which you want to work. And so there are opportunities that way. The best way is also developing relationships with the agencies that you want to target for funding. And so that's a good way of getting information in advance. One of the slides I included, and I hope you get a chance to look at it, many agencies publish what are called white papers, which are problems that they anticipate coming in the future. So if you read these white papers, you can actually figure out where their funding is going to go for years to come. The other is, and so partially for the Singapore question, yes, there are opportunities through the State Department for opportunities all over the world. The US actually funds programs all over the world, and if you're doing the work, they're happy to entertain your proposal.